Welcome to another chat with AVID, David Harpool and Jack Arnold. Jack, good to see you.
Good to see you, Dave.
Imagine that. Start recording.
The lights go.
Hey, what was that thing back in the day? It was like, the clapper.
Yeah.
You remember that? Clap on, clap off. Anyway, welcome to a chat with AVID. Today we're going to talk about cash flow, but where it came up with, at least what we kind of started with, was I was reading an article yesterday about a young man in Iowa, and his name is Luke Thill. And the premise to the story was Luke was 11 years old and had this grand idea to build a tiny house from scratch in his backyard. So once he got permission from his parents, he put together a plan, a budget, a plan, and then really over the next 2 years, so 11 to 13, executed building an 89 square foot tiny house in the backyard. And as I was reading it, it just really hit me, the correlation between that and our personal lives and managing cash, how we view what comes in, what goes out, and really where we give priorities to. And if you think of a tiny house at 89 square feet, you can't really overindulge, right? Because if you do, you're going to be stepping over things and tripping things. So I just thought it was really awesome that an 11-year-old really put so much effort and time into that. And that he himself said the most difficult thing was budgeting and planning for it. And I think it's extremely applicable to who we are today. So I don't think you've ever built a tiny house, right, Jack?
No, I have trouble putting together IKEA furniture. So I don't know how an 11-year-old put a tiny house together, but that's another video probably.
What do you think? I mean, this is kind of throwing it out at you as a correlation between the tiny house and our finances, but I really do think there's a lot to extrapolate for it and some strong lessons to learn, really.
Yes, it's a good metaphor. I mean, the cash flow thing is like my wheelhouse. I think it's like probably the most important thing. And it kind of runs from, I don't care what your income is, if it's $25,000 a year or $2.5 million a year, the cash flow is going to be the most important thing that you do, and how you allocate it and how you prioritize and how you stick to those priorities. I think that's probably the most important thing. I mean, nobody really has unlimited resources,
right?
Even if you're, say, Bill Gates, let's say, the guy's trying to cure malaria, but he has to choose. He can't do everything. I mean, he has to pick and choose the things that he's focused on and prioritize them and focus it on it, because it just is not unlimited as far as the resources, whether that's just money or time or effort or whatever it is. The budgeting word is always like a bad word for some reason. It always seems as if it's a punishment for something.
Yeah, it's a restriction on life. Well, yeah. I can't spend my money. And really, we've always said it is a bad connotation. If anything, having some sort of parameters to your spending really should relieve anxiety, in my opinion.
Yeah. Done right, that's what it should do. It does force discipline on you, because but it's being forced on you either by yourself or by somebody else if you don't do it. I mean, there are limitations. It's almost like a puzzle or a game or something. Like if you just had a game, like a board game, and it was a blank board and a bunch of random pieces, and you threw the pieces on a blank board and you said, have fun. That would suck. That's not a fun game. You would immediately start making rules. Like, okay, let's come up with some rules. Basketball has, for the most part, some pretty basic rules. There's not tons of rules that go into it, but they're rules, and you have to play within those rules. But there's tons of creativity within those rules. So if you are, doing cash flow, let's say, the tiny house thing, he had some rules. He had a limited amount of space that he had to work with, and he had to use his creativity to make the most of that space. That's kind of the challenge of having a tiny house, or anything else for that matter. So if you're doing like cash flow stuff, the more you can kind of turn it into, I don't want to say it's a game per se, but give yourself some parameters so that you can start to use your creativity and say, well, I have this much to work with. What's the best way that I can accomplish the things that I want to accomplish working within the system and in these rules? And you'd be surprised how creative and how on top of it you'll be. You just giving yourself some basic rules.
For sure. Well, and this young man, the article went on to describe some of the things he went through, but his budget was like $1,500. And he probably realized that that wasn't going to do a whole lot. So he actually bartered, if you will, some of his services for others. So he went to one of the neighbors, I think is what it said, and he cleaned out the garage. And in exchange, this neighbor was good with electric, so helped him with some wiring. So, we can do that ourselves. That's like the trade-off between what we're spending our money on and what we're doing or giving, with some sort of reward. And I think that's a good analogy to use. Is
yeah. And his first option wasn't to go borrow money from somebody. Like
correct.
How can what's some other ways that I can solve this without having to, just take the path of least resistance and just borrow it? Like I can clean somebody's garage or something.
Correct.
Not that you're going to go out and start cleaning garages, let's say, if you're trying to earn more, but the budgeting and cash flow stuff is obviously what's coming in, but there's nothing to say that you can't say, well, let me just work on getting more coming in so that I can do more of the things that I want to do. It's perfectly legitimate, but that doesn't mean that all of a sudden the necessity or the benefit of managing the cash flow goes away. Just because you start making more. I would say it's more important because it's easier to be frivolous because there's no real pain. Like once you get over a certain amount, it's not as if you don't do it, like you can't eat this week or something, or put gas in the car. Like when you're just getting started out and you're just kind of working your way up, and those things matter. But you start doing pretty well, and that doesn't become a concern. It's much easier to be frivolous because there's no immediate pain. It's pushed off into the future, but you're not feeling it immediately. The feedback loop is very wide when you're making a lot. When you're not making much, it's almost immediate. So,
right. Well, and we talked about the, like refinancing was a recent topic that we talked about, but in general, I think a lot of times our first thought is borrowing the money because it's super easy.
Yep.
Whether it's a card in my pocket or going to the bank or equity in the house or whatever it may be, those kind of tools are out there to get at it quickly. But it might make more sense that before you do that, let's start to think, all right, what other creative ways can I come up with it? And you did make a good point. For some of us or some people listening, even, you might be capped in terms of your income or your salary as an individual or household. So it's really important then to understand, okay, this is what's coming in. This is where things are going out. And are they going in the directions that I want them to? Because if not, then that's where really tweaking can help you really get ahead of the game, feel good about how you're spending the money, where it's going. And you're not constantly thinking, okay, well, when I make more, then I'll do X. Then I'll start to save. Because we've been doing this long enough, without the savings, it's going to be really hard as a 65-year-old, 70-year-old to maintain probably the lifestyle you're having today without some sort of aggressive savings rate.
Absolutely. I think this has to do with we did a, thing on GameStop, which is a little bit of a, that was a few, I guess in January at this point, a month, 6 weeks ago. Yeah. And then we did the one on speculative investments, which I'm not sure that we've put out yet, but just how you can use those in your portfolio. But I think those things, speculative investments, GameStop, these kinds of things, wanting to put money into some real estate deal that's like high, just super leverage. Anytime you get those things, it always, for the most part, comes from a place of, I need a Hail Mary. Like I haven't saved. I'm not going to save. I'm not going to track my cash flow. I'm going to just put some money into some things and hope they just go lights out and bail me out from having to be disciplined enough to stick with the cash flow plan. And it just doesn't work. It will work for somebody. Somebody wins the lottery, but the chances of that being you is zero. I mean, somebody won the Powerball that was, whatever, $1 billion a few months. Somebody won that, but it probably won't be you. And if that's the thing that you're kind of banking on, it's probably not going to work out. So the opposite of that is keeping track of your cash flow, working within your parameters, getting some enjoyment out of it, seeing it as something that gives you freedom to spend the money on the things that you really want to spend it on, but also give you an idea. There's lots of things you're spending money on that you probably don't care about very much, and try to minimize those things.
I think it'd be good too to use just some, I guess, mathematical examples of, saving versus spending. and the impact of that. Right before we got on here, we were talking about, what it would take to be able to maintain your lifestyle. Let's say today you spend $5,000 a month as a family, and we'll assume you make $100,000, which is, I think, reasonable. It's a great living. Some people make a lot more and some people make less, but just for numbers sake, what would it take 20 years from now to be able to live the same way, still spend the $5,000 a month? So Jack pulled out his calculator. You probably still have it handy, but I think the math was in order to do that, and assuming that you take money out at about a 4% rate, which, I guess it's a norm, an industry standard, if you will, you need to have about $1.5 million set aside in liquid net worth so that you could pull out that $5,000 a month to live on.
Right. And of course, there's so many assumptions built into that. So it's a very
back of the napkin,
cooked down version of what you'd actually have to do. But it's illustrated to say that it takes a significant amount of money to generate enough income to live. If, retirement is your goal, or some kind of independence for that matter is your goal, it's going to take a pretty significant amount of money to do it. And there's two sides to it. Obviously, spending and saving are, the opposite of each other, but money that you're not spending is money that you're saving. So you can reduce your spending and increase your savings as well, but you can also increase your income and increase both. So, there's ways to do that as well. So, the other thing we were talking about was today, if you were the kind of person that lived on $5,000, or you needed $5,000 a month to maintain your lifestyle, whatever that was, let's say you're retiring or you're going to be financially independent somehow, regardless of your age, to have $5,000 a month, if you use the 4%, it's $1.5 million, but $1.5 million of net worth puts you something like in the 95th percentile or something in terms of net worth in America, which is probably in the 0.1% of net worth in the world. So you're way up the scale if you already have that. So if you are a person who's trying to get to the point where you have that much type of net worth, you'd have to know that being in the 95th percentile is an uncommon result. It's going to take uncommon efforts and uncommon task to do that. So if you're going to get there, you'd have to do some things that aren't otherwise norms that you would see. So that's going to be focusing on cash flow, saving a significant part. We usually say 20% is a good goal to shoot for. Those kinds of things, which are probably rare, but that's the way that you get to the point that you can actually do that, having a long-term focus, doing the same thing over and over and over again for a very long time. It's not putting your money in whatever the kind of flavor of the day is and hoping that bails you out. It's just getting your good returns over and over and over again for decades at a time is how you get to that how you get to that point.
And that's not fun or easy, really. I immediately, probably because I played golf for the first time in a while this past weekend with some buddies, and had some good shots and some bad shots, but I don't play, so what do I expect? But I did think of, I got a little blister on my finger, professional athletes, and reading stories of Phil Mickelson being in the backyard, literally hitting so many balls that his hands were bleeding, just sand shot after sand shot after sand shot and sand shot. And you watch that man hit out of the sand, it's like, how did he do that? Well, because he hit 1,000 sand shots weekly for 20 years. Like, that's not, I wouldn't call that probably fun. And I don't think he probably would have called it fun, but he was determined to be one of the best, the top 1% of athletes in the world.
Right.
It's really no different. I mean, it's money and it's habits, and those are athletes, but they still have the same issues. We brought that up before, like Matthew McConaughey and his determination, right? But on the surface, you could say, oh, this guy's got more money than he knows what to do with, and it doesn't matter. And I don't think that's the case. So.
And he's, that's a case of, I don't think that's the only thing that he's doing it for, which is kind of cliche, obviously, but, he obviously has a purpose other than just make a lot of money. This is lots of people. It's not as if Phil Mickelson, for example, or any other Tiger Woods, hopefully ends up okay with this whole car crash thing. But, these aren't people that necessarily, they're not winning tournaments for money. They certainly have enough. I'm sure that it's nice, but that's not the only thing that's driving them, because you'd get to a point where you're making enough money where it's what's another $1 million if you already have 100 of them. I mean, at some point, I'm sure that kind of the extra marginal benefit goes away. It's hitting shots till your hands bleed for decades, and then going out there, performing, winning tournaments, and still hitting shots until your hands bleed so that you can keep up and continue to get better. That's like the daily action stuff that you have to do. That's probably not the most fun thing. And even if it is fun, it's repetitive and you're doing it all the time. And sometimes you just have to do it. That's cash flow. Monitoring and managing your cash flow is a daily thing. And that will build on itself over the course of your life as long as you do it. But it is every day. It's an everyday thing. You just have to pay attention to it, and it will work. If you don't pay attention to it, it might work, but probably not. It's not going, and it's certainly not going to work out as well as it could had you managed your cash flow. But it's not an easy thing, and it's certainly not it's a learned skill. It takes time. You really have to put some effort into it. And it's a learned skill. It's not something you just start doing and you're great at it. It takes a while.
But it also helps to follow your purpose, if you will, and your passions, because then you know exactly where your money's going and if it's in line with the things you want to do. To go back to the article real quick, Jason, the young man went on to help his twin brother, build a tiny trailer off the back of the truck that they went. The article said they've gone to like 50 different campsites, and it's just been such a great experience. And long-term, I believe he's 17 now, going into higher education, if you will, and he wants to be a paramedic. He wants to be in an environment where he can help people. And a lot of that comes from what he's learned at a young age doing these tiny house trailer things. So having a purpose, knowing it, thinking about it, we always say think, plan, live in that order first. It's really hard to take the time to think about it. But if you put your mind to it and you say, okay, this is really what I'm trying to do, it makes those mundane, boring, everyday cash flow tasks a little bit easier, really, because you have purpose, you have a focus on why you're doing it.
It's centering. It gives you something to shoot for sure.
Right, exactly. Well, good to chat with you about cash flow and tiny houses. Who would have thought there's a correlation, but I think we found a couple. If you have any questions, have any thoughts or topics you'd like us to cover, let us know. We do this every Tuesday. Look forward to seeing you next week.
All right. See you, Dave.
All right. Have a good week.